to our Crockpot. Crockpot is our sort of flagship event series here at the Kroc School, where we usually have a chance to share out our ongoing projects, what we're thinking, whether that be research or practice orientated. And in recent years, we've started to expand this to kind of our extended family and intellectual partners a little bit more widely. I also just want to thank Daria, first of all, because she does everything that like I am associated with. She's basically getting the credit for. I think, you know, sort of this year, as you all know, will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so, you know, 250 years is a pretty good run, I guess. I think that like we as the Kroc School have not particularly wrestled with exactly what we're dealing with in this moment, even as executive orders start to come down targeting institutions of higher education. So I think that there's no one better to help us start, you know, to see what this moment for what it is and help us guide, to be guided through it than Sasha Abramsky. He is the Nation magazine's Western States correspondent. Over the last 30 years, he has been published in The Atlantic and the Rolling Stone, The Guardian, Mother Jones, others. He has a new book, Chaos Comes Calling. He has, for the past 20 years, taught writing and journalism at UC Davis. I believe you are also, perhaps still are, a senior fellow at Demos.
Not anymore.
Not any longer.
Just because they got rid of their fellowships.
Okay. But we are delighted to have him here. I just learned that I've known about him for some time. I just learned that I actually live here.
Yes.
So hopefully this can be a conversation that is extended beyond the confines of this room and beyond the temporal scope of today. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for that generous introduction. And you put an awful lot of pressure on me because apparently when you leave here in an hour and 15 minutes, you will know why the American Republic has just ended. So no pressure. But yes, I do live here half time and would one day love to, you know, teach in a place like USD. But seriously, I'm really happy to be in a place that is one of 200 academic institutions that signed a letter of resistance this week saying that they would not bend to Trump's executive orders. I think it is extraordinarily important that universities do take a stand in this moment, and especially universities with institutions like this one, which is dedicated to every best ideal that America has managed to put together over the 250 years of its existence, from humanitarian assistance to the soft power of diplomacy, to caring for refugees and asylum seekers, to working out how to get healthcare access expanded to those without healthcare. It's precisely institutions like this that have to stand up to this tide of authoritarianism. So what I thought I'd do today is talk. We got about an hour and 10 minutes, give or take. I thought I'd talk for about 40 minutes and then throw it open for about half an hour of conversation. If I go on too long, somebody throw a piece of food at me or do whatever you need to do to get me off. I'm going to stand, if you don't mind, just because I realize that I have more energy when I stand than when I sit. So a little bit about who I am. As Topher just said, I write for the Nation magazine, have done for years and years since I got out of journalism school. But I freelance as well. I freelance for lots of different places. My emphasis over 30 years of writing has been social justice work. That's what I care about. I write on economic injustice and inequality. I've written books and articles on the prison system and the rise of mass incarceration. I write on homelessness. I write on immigrants, both those with documents and those without documents. I generally sort of find that my writing works and my brain gets stimulated when I'm thinking about the underside, the underbelly of American society, the stories that often get ignored or pushed under the rug, or that we like to whitewash because they're inconvenient to our narratives about who we are. And I'm far less interested in the stories of the rich and powerful. They have more than enough voices and more than enough outputs in the world. What interests me about their stories is not them per se, but how they impact other people. What impacts me about the Trump moment is not Trump per se, though he is an interesting character in the most destructive, bizarre way. But what really interests me is what this moment means for our institutions and for our social systems and for our community and our culture, and I guess in the most grandiose level, our civilization. 10 years ago, when I had more hair and it was darker color, Nation magazine put me on the Trump beat. And at the time, what they were really interested in, this was just after he'd come down his gold elevator and he'd strode out to the world and he said, Mexicans are bringing us their drug dealers and their criminals and their rapists and their murderers, and maybe a few good people too, or whatever nonsense he said. And he was using language in the most inflammatory way. No politician since George Wallace had used language that inflammatory in American politics, except he was way better as a demagogue than George Wallace. And George Wallace was a pretty good demagogue. But Trump took it to another level. We were looking at, McCarthy, Mussolini, Hitler levels of demagoguery. And the Nation wanted me to explore the language that he was using to build this movement. And so my first few articles about Trump were about the simplification of the English language. The fact that he was building a movement around tweets, the fact that he was building a movement around exclamation marks and deliberately unpunctuated or mispunctuated or misspelled social media, and that he was using language that was designed to create a movement based around fear and hatred and anger. And there was nothing accidental about it. I mean, there are many things Trump does that are accidental, but the use of language was deliberate and it was calculated, and it had very, very obvious fascist antecedents. And so I started writing about that and thinking about that. And as I wrote about it, I got more and more interested in why so many Americans in the year 2015, so 10 years ago now, why so many Americans were getting drawn to this vision that was both extraordinarily hard right and also in so many ways irrationalist. That this wasn't a movement that was based around careful, calm consideration of the facts and of the evidence. This was a movement that was emotional. It was based around a certain set of very bastardized emotions. And he was using it in an extraordinarily transformative way. And I think in 2015, there really weren't that many people, even in the political sphere, who fully understood what was about to unfold. Because what was unfolding was something new in American history. It was the idea that you would have somebody who would have executive powers and who would use that not even with the pretense of the common good, but who would use it to self-enrich, to divide and conquer, to break down institutions, and to warp America into the image of strongman governance. And I found this fascinating and horrifying, probably the other way around. I found it horrifying, but also fascinating. And over the last 10 years, I have written on many other things as well, but predominantly over the last 10 years, my writing has been the variance on the theme of what's going on here. What is happening to render a character like Trump, who should be utterly implausible in the political arena in a complicated, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy, what renders a man like Trump plausible? And that reporting took me ultimately to two counties in the Northwest, which form the basis of this book. One of the counties is way in the north of California. It's called Siskiyou County. If any of you have been up to Mount Shasta, it's in that area. It's beautiful. It's stunning. It's got some of the most wild scenery you will see in this country. It's also got some of the craziest right-wing politics you will experience in this country. And so in 2020, when I got interested in Siskiyou County, it's the middle of the pandemic, the traditional Reagan Republican kind of board of supervisors had just been challenged by hard right insurgents who were aligned with local militia. And the chairman of the board of supervisors had been recalled in an election campaign. And the government had basically veered into this far-right caricature, QAnon-based, antithetical to any public health restrictions, obsessed with gun rights, and very, very violent, both in its rhetoric and ultimately in kind of actions that it tolerated. So Siskiyou County was the first place that I decided I'd do some reporting in. Second one was a little county on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State called Clallam County. And Clallam's a kind of interesting place because it was one of a handful of rural bellwether counties that I think from the Reagan period onwards had always voted for the winner of the presidential election. Except in 2020, in 2016, when it bucked the trend and it voted, I think it voted Democrat instead of Republican. But basically it was a bellwether county, which kind of veered rightward, leftward, depending on the moment. And its county seat was a little town called Squim. And Squim was more or less a retirement community. It was this beautiful little place, had a few tens of thousands of people, and by most measures was quite a calm place. It wasn't desperately poor. It didn't have massive homeless problems. It didn't have, a lot of the fissures that bigger cities have. But it did have an undercurrent of this hard right politics, especially in the sort of more rural areas outside the center of Squim. And before the pandemic started, almost in a fit of absence of mind, it let a QAnon supporter become mayor in 2017. And what basically happened is, like with many, many local elections, too few people voted. And a lot of liberals, a lot of Democrats just thought, yeah, we'll pay attention to the federal elections. Maybe we'll even vote for our governor. Can't be bothered to vote in local elections. Problem was the right wing was organizing and the right wing did vote in local elections. And more power to them. Part of their strategy over the last 20, 30 years has been not just capturing federal positions, but capturing every level of government. So the right wing was paying attention to local government in Clallam County, and they won a majority of the city council votes in Squim. And the majority on the city council then nominated this local barber called William Armacost to be the mayor. And Armacost was a character. He was a motorcyclist. He wore these sort of very right-wing slogans on his leather motorcycle jacket. He was absolutely, like Trump, unwilling to silence his mouth and would say whatever came to mind, however inflammatory or distasteful it was. He was also the first elected official in America to publicly identify with QAnon. This was in early 2017. And William Armacost started going on his radio shows and he started saying, well, hey, you guys pay attention to QAnon. It's not all bad news. There's some really good stuff that it's espousing. And he started using his official podium to spout QAnon propaganda. And the reason this is important, the reason this is more than just a story about a rural area in Northern California and a rural area in the Olympic Peninsula, the reason this has national, for me anyway, national significance is what was going on in both of those two areas in the run-up to the pandemic and then during the pandemic was very, very similar in many ways to what was going on nationally and the fissures that were emerging and the schisms that were emerging and the divides that were emerging. Now, there were a few issues that gained more and more prominence. So one of them was when the pandemic took off, public health and the lockdowns and the school closures and the church closures and the business closures, all these things that may have been necessary from a public health perspective, but enraged a lot of people, especially in rural communities where people felt that these were big city problems. They didn't really understand why they should be locked down as well. So as the pandemic goes on, all of those fissures get exacerbated. It's like rocket fuel to things that are already under the surface. At the same time, Trump's throwing fuel on the fire, not just on the pandemic, but on cultural war issues. Whether that's immigration, whether it's gay rights, whether it's abortion, whether it's transgender rights, whether it's religion, whatever it might be, Trump had this unerring instinct to find fissures and to then open them up and turn them into yawning chasms. Now, it seems to me that what we were looking at by 2020 was the overlay of 3 black swan moments. Black swan moment is just something sort of utterly out of left field that comes and sort of hits us aside the head and leaves us in a very vulnerable place. And the 3 black swan moments were the rise of social media, which utterly destroys in a very, very short time period the way that we understand and absorb and circulate news. And it led at speed to the collapse of a news reading culture and the replacement by a clickbait culture. And that's got all kinds of problems. I talk about it with my media classes all the time. But the most basic, obvious point is it leaves you vulnerable to propaganda, because all the guardrails that are there in traditional news, the editors, the fact checkers, everything else gets broken down in a social media environment, and all you get are echo chambers. And the stories that circulate aren't the stories that are accurate, they're the stories that are most clickbaitable. And the stories that gain credibility are not stories that are accurate, but they're the stories that get the most clicks. So you have the sort of the opposite of a virtuous circle. You have a social media environment that spirals us downward into propaganda and rumor and misinformation. Layered on top of that, you have the politicians, Trump, but not just Trump, who emerged out of that social media environment, who knew how to use it in the pursuit of demagogic ends. And so we have the rise of a political movement around Donald Trump that's pretty much unprecedented in US history. That's Black Swan event number 2. And then Black Swan event number 3, the pandemic. You have a once in a century respiratory pandemic that's almost uncontrollable, and that the public health world knows if it's allowed to spread completely unhindered, is going to overwhelm the hospital system. And so you have this stampede toward emergency responses that public health recommends, that political figures endorse, and not just in America, but all over the world. And I'm sure everyone in this room remembers those days 5 years ago when the world just ground to a halt. You could look at New York, London, Paris, Shanghai, Moscow, it didn't matter where you were looking, the great cities of the world had gone into deep freeze. But not just the great cities, rural areas too, everywhere. Our normal ways of life had just stopped. You put all 3 of those together, the potential for misinformation you can spread on social media, the willingness to demagogue pretty much anything that a politician like Donald Trump has, and the conditions of the pandemic, and you have the potential for a political upheaval like we've never seen before. And so, in a sense, Trump 1 was a prologue. It was bad, but most of Trump 1 occurred before the pandemic. What we're seeing now, I believe, is the actual main story itself. Because what we're seeing now is this period of demagoguery that was fine-tuned by the conditions of the pandemic and that acquired millions and millions of supporters out of an alienation from the pandemic and the public health restrictions. And in a sense, if Trump sort of primed the culture to become coarse and to become violent, the pandemic is when that violence and coarsening reaches full blossom. And 2 of the characters in my book who I focus on are public health officers, both women. The public health officer in Siskiyou County was an ex-military doctor called Karen Ramstrom. Public health officer in Clallam County was a young woman called Dr. Alison Berry. Both of these women were tough as nails. Both of them had worked in extraordinarily difficult environments. In Alison Berry's case, she had worked in some of the toughest inner city hospitals in Baltimore and in Seattle. She had dealt with uninsured, with seriously drug addicted, with seriously mentally ill. She dealt with people with post-traumatic stress disorder. She dealt with refugees and asylum seekers, people who had got enormous weights on their shoulders. And oftentimes people who were quite inchoate and quite violent. And she knew how to deal with those situations. She was not somebody who scared easily. But the pandemic scared her. Because in the pandemic, both she and Karen Ramstrom and numerous other doctors around the country who were trying to implement public health measures ended up with armed lynch mobs outside their offices trying to kill them, quite literally, and ended up with young men in pickup trucks with long-arm rifles hunting for them in their neighborhoods, trying to find them to kill them and their children. And both of them ended up in a political environment where instead of the political leadership at the local level supporting them, the political leaders basically sided with the mob. So in the case of Siskiyou County, there'd been this recall campaign against Leonard Moti, who was the sort of, moderately conservative leader of the Board of Supervisors, and he'd ended up being replaced by a new chairman of the board called Patrick Jones, who was as conspiratorialist as you could get. Comes out of the John Birch movement, he's a QAnon supporter, he's a fanatical Second Amendment person, and he hates public health. And he just poo-pooed the whole thing. He said these death threats are no big deal, it's all just publicity for the public health workers, nothing to look at here. Up in Clallam County, Allisonbury at the county level had more support because the county governance was still quite liberal. But at the city level in Squim, Mayor Armacost did the same thing. He just refused to get engaged, refused to use his podium to try and turn back the mob, and basically left her to her own devices. Both of them thankfully survived. Both of them ended up with trauma. Now, if you don't mind, what I thought I'd do for just 2 or 3 minutes is read you just a couple pages from the beginning of this book, which describes some of the circumstances faced by these 2 public health officers. Now, in Alison Berry's case, the worst moment for her was not 2020, but it was 2021. It was after the vaccines. And the reason was vaccines came in, many people took the vaccines. Everyone was desperate to get back into public. They wanted the businesses to reopen, the governments wanted businesses to reopen and tax base to come back. And so Washington State began reopening. And even though people were vaccinated, not enough people were vaccinated. And what happened was they reopened the restaurants and the bars and the cafes. And there was this surge in infections that completely overwhelmed the local hospitals. And Berry realized that unless she did something, there were going to be people dying in hospital corridors without access to treatment because they couldn't get into beds to get treatment. And so she implemented a local vaccine mandate. The vaccine mandate said you can go to restaurants and you can go to cafes and you can go to bars, but you have to show a vaccine card at the door to get in. It's common sense. And it was, as a public health measure, very successful. Within 2 weeks, infection rate and then the death rate had plummeted. And it was so successful, the whole state of Washington took it up. But she became a lightning rod, not just for local anti-vaxxers, but for anti-vaxxers all around Washington, then anti-vaxxers all around the United States, and then through social media, she started getting hate mail from around the world. So this young woman, public health officer in this very small area in Washington State, became a lightning rod for a global anti-vaccine response. And I'll read you how this played out. And the language is salty, so I apologize, but it's not my language, it's the language of the idiots who wrote to her. Recently separated from her husband and raising her toddler daughter as a single mom, Berry suddenly found herself front center stage in a bitter conflict that risked tearing the country apart. Armed mobs began showing up outside her public health offices, threatening to lynch the doctor and her colleagues. When the phones rang in her office, her colleagues girded themselves, knowing that there was a pretty good chance the person on the other end of the line would begin hurling obscenities at them as soon as they answered. When Berry opened her emails, she steeled herself for the barrage of hateful, frequently obscene messages that would flood her inbox. Generally, Berry felt with a justifiable pride that she was hard to scare, but she admitted, I was scared here. I was absolutely scared here. I'm definitely scared of white supremacists and misogynists who want me dead. The emails especially gave her the chills. You're a brazen hypocrite who gets off on torturing children, much like your creepy Nazi Pope gets off on torturing puppies. Moreover, you and anyone going along with your mass coerced medical experiment and the prolonged torture of children will face judgment. When a fairly typical one dated October 28, 2021. After a few more venomous paragraphs, the author signed off with a happy Halloween. It was, to say the least, creepy. But when Berry forwarded it to the sheriff's office, the sheriff determined that it didn't rise to the level of a specific criminal threat. On Facebook, one outraged anti-vaxxer waxed that, quote, it is my religious freedom to not get vaccinated. And then, using most unreligious language, he waned, fuck every single one of you cunts. Hundreds of miles to the south, in California's sparsely populated Shasta County, public health officer Karen Ramstrom was facing a similar set of terrors. As COVID spread and as local public health officials desperately tried to craft regulations to keep the populace safe, talk radio hosts would go on their shows and tell their audiences of anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, anti-rhinos, Republicans in name only, and anti-Black Lives Matters, that it was time for blood to flow in the streets. Quote, communists only recognize the limits of their power when their necks are stretched upon one shock jock on the Reading-based KCNR 1460 AM radio station. A Facebook group called Open Shasta put up a posting about, quote, taking out Dr. Ramstrom. A flood of other online threats soon followed. Anti-vaxxers picketed the public health officers. Fearing violence, the Reading Police Department ramped up patrols of Ramstrom's neighborhood. So intimidating were the threats that for a short time, Ramstrom even had a security team stationed outside of her house. She put up cameras around her home. After a slew of particularly horrifying threats, she had to give statements to investigators from the DA's office. When she looked to the county's elected officials for support, Ramstrom was rebuffed. Several hard-right members of the County Board of Supervisors pointedly refused to meet with her to show their support. Instead, they urged their colleagues to go to bat against the county and the state's public health responses and to refuse to enforce the lockdown, non-essential business closings, and masking mandates. When the more moderate members balked at this, the hard-right contingent, backed by local militia members, parents' rights advocates, and a bevy of fundamentalist churches, pushed a recall campaign against, and in doing so, turned Shasta County into an epicenter for the burgeoning anti-vaccine and anti-masker movements, building to a head across America. Now, what important about all of this is this floating sense of righteous anger, where people sort of assumed an empowerment, but the empowerment wasn't constructive. The empowerment was basically, I have a right to spout conspiracies, evidence be damned. I have a right to be violent, civic norms be damned. I have a right to issue anonymous threats against public officials, the law be damned. Now, all of that is kind of what Trump is doing today from the platform of the White House, withdrawing security protections from Anthony Fauci and from political enemies, issuing executive orders shaking down law firms or universities, deporting people without due process into gulags in El Salvador. We're witnessing a complete collapse of norms, all of which were prefigured in places like Clallam County, in places like Shasta County, and I know I said Siskiyou County earlier, my mistake, Shasta County, in the last 4, 5, 6 years. Now, the thing is, none of it came out of the blue. Yes, you had these 3 black swan moments, but I've been reporting on America's underside for 30 years. And much of what I've been reporting on has been this build-up to chaos. And there are things that were on the fringe 30 years ago when I started reporting, which have now been mainstreamed by Trump and Trump's version of or vision of the Republican Party. The first time I came to San Diego was in 1996. I was 24 years old. And there were 2 political conventions going on here that summer. The first was the Republican convention that nominated Bob Dole. That was boring. I mean, Bob Dole was not a particularly nice character, but nor was he a completely insane character. He was just a run-of-the-mill moderate Republican. But right next door to it, there was another convention that was wackadoodle. And that convention was the US Taxpayers Party. The US Taxpayers Party had been set up by a man called Howard Phillips, who was a Nixon aide in the early 1970s, and had then veered progressively rightward. And the US Taxpayers Party embraced all kinds of weird, wacky, far-out theories that no normal politician would ever embrace. For example, they were opposed to the IRS and wanted to fire most IRS workers. They believed that vaccines were a conspiracy and the parents should not vaccinate their children. They were opposed to any environmental or climate change research or policies. They believed that international institutions like the United Nations or any American involvement with international projects like USAID were definitionally bad and that we shouldn't be a part of them. All of these things that were so right-wing that no self-respecting politician would possibly go near them. So fast forward 30 years, that's where the Republican Party under Donald Trump is. There's been this sort of movement rightwards, the Overton window of what's possible on right-wing politics and in the right-wing ecosystem. That Overton window has shifted rightward and rightward and rightward. But beyond just the sort of politics, there's a cultural shift that's going on. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Elon Musk tweeted that empathy equaled civilizational death. That if you were someone who was consumed with empathy for other people, especially weaker people, especially vulnerable people, you were undermining the foundations of your own culture and would die. Well, there's nothing new about that. That was Nazi ideology. Quite straightforwardly, that was Nazi ideology. But more immediately, in the American context, we've gone through a period of 30 plus years now where year in, year out, we have experienced rising economic inequality. Year in, year out, we've experienced a growing homelessness crisis, especially in the aftermath of 2008, where a vast number of Americans were disempowered and disenfranchised from the housing market, lost their homes, lost their savings, lost their assets that were a part of, their life project, basically, because housing prices plummeted. They were underwater. And then they got a double whammy, because in places like California, after housing prices plummeted and a whole bunch of people lost their homes and became renters or ended up homeless, then the housing market got so tight that the prices rebounded. And they were double priced out of the market. So first they had houses and lost them, and then they couldn't get back into the housing market because of what happened to the real estate market in the last 15, 16 years. Well, that also lays the groundwork for catastrophe. Because we're basically saying, you don't deserve it, you're other. You've done something wrong, you made bad judgments, you've messed up economically, and now you are never going to have housing security. Well, if people at the top don't empathize with the people at the bottom struggling to maintain housing, what does that say and do for our political culture? So we have the cascading economic inequality and housing inequality. We have the rise of an oligarchy. We don't like to talk about the American oligarchy, or at least we didn't until it became so spectacularly unavoidable 6 months ago. But we have the rise of an oligarchy every bit as powerful and every bit as economically malicious as the Russian oligarchy. I'm doing work at the moment on the federal workers and what's happened to the federal workforce. Trump put Elon Musk in charge of a project to downsize in the most vicious way possible, the most humiliating, the most deliberately cruel way possible, a workforce that employs 2.3 million people. 2.3 million people. The entire federal payroll, and that includes health insurance benefits, pension benefits, and everything else, the entire federal payroll for those 2.3 million people was $336 billion last year. The man Trump put in charge to destroy at least 10% of that federal payroll and to install fear of God into 2.3 million workers was Elon Musk, who single-handedly is worth more than the annual federal payroll. Think of that. There are 2.2 million federal workers. Elon Musk is worth $100 billion more than the entire federal payroll. Now, if you allow as a society that kind of inequality to happen, you definitionally get a collapse in empathy. Because the people right at the top have literally nothing in common with those below them. The people making decisions literally have nothing to say to the people who aren't so successful in life or aren't so financially invulnerable in life. So you have that, you have the economic inequality. You have the rise of mass homelessness and its acceptance, its normalization. We see the homeless, but we consider them the other. Again, like the people who lost out post-2008. Today's homeless, they must have done something wrong. They must have smoked the wrong drug. They must have fried their mind in the wrong way. But they are the other, we don't need to be concerned about them. And tied in with this, which is an area, David, you know that I wrote about, is Mass incarceration. Mass incarceration was probably the single most destructive moral experiment, other than slavery, in American history. We made a series of policy decisions in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that were guaranteed, not just likely to, but guaranteed to put millions of our fellow citizens behind bars. We created, in the space of 25 years, the largest incarceration system in human history, with the possible exception of the Soviet Gulag and the Nazi concentration camps. But in terms of raw numbers, and I'm not saying the Gulag or the concentration camps were the same as the US system. They were far worse than the US system. So I'm not making a comparison in terms of lives lost or anything like that. But just in terms of the raw numbers, America made a decision to put a spectacularly large percentage of its own population into federal prisons, state prisons, and local county jails. Now, again, if you make that kind of policy decision and you decide that a certain part of your population is so far outside the moral boundaries that all you have to do is lock them up and throw away the key, again, you cannot help but break down the bonds of empathy. You just can't say we're going to have a society with millions and millions of people behind bars and millions of other people guarding those people behind bars and not have a breakdown of the common story. And I think all of those things, all of those different streams are now coming together into the torrent that is Trumpism in 2025. The reason that 18 million people, or whatever the number was, voted for a man like Donald Trump, it wasn't because the price of eggs was too high. I know that's the narrative, that a lot of people got upset because the price of eggs was too high and therefore they voted for a fascist. You know, yes, I was upset that the price of eggs was too high too. It didn't make fascism more intellectually or morally plausible for me. You know, I mean, it's just that there is such a cognitive breakdown that you could look at what Trump was saying and doing and proposing in 2024 and somehow think that it all would be forgiven if he got the price of eggs down. It didn't make sense. It clearly wasn't about eggs. It was about something else. It was this deeply authoritarian, irrational, angry crisis, social media, homelessness, economic inequality, mass incarceration. All of this was coming together, and all of this was giving an opening for demagogic politics. And so I want to end it in a minute because I know, we're going to have a conversation here. But what I want you to think about is what that means. What it means is we handed over the keys to the castle to a man who is taking his cues politically from people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, that clearly admires Mussolini and Hitler, frequently quotes from Mussolini and Hitler's speeches. He doesn't attribute it, but if you do a deep dive and you actually look at some of the quotes and some of the phrases that Trump has come up with, and then you go into the records, you can find an overlap. And I know that because I've done it. You can find a very precise overlap with some of Trump's language, especially with Hitler's language. You can also, and this is sort of where it gets a bit weirder, you can find an overlap with Stalin's language. When Trump started talking a few years ago about the enemy within, that's Stalinism. When Trump started talking about vermin to describe immigrants, that's Hitler. He's an equal opportunity demagogue. He swings right when it suits him, he swings left when it suits him. But he's a demagogue, and he says and does the most atrocious things to accumulate power and to break down opposition. And so here we are in 2025, and I'm speaking at a university which thankfully has decided it's going to stand up to Trump, and it's going to sign on to academic resistance to Trump. But make no mistake, this isn't an abstract battle. When you were talking, Topher, about the Republic having had a good 250-year run, a few years ago, when it wasn't just me, there were a few journalists out there saying, Trump is a danger not just to civic norms, but to the survival of the Republic. Most commentators were like, that's hyperbolic. You were putting yourself fairly on the fringe if you said something like that. If you say something like that today, you are mainstream. I read a column by David Brooks in the New York Times the other day. Brooks is like a deeply conservative Republican commentator. And Brooks said, we are facing such a mortal peril that we need to work out the most creative forms of resistance this country has ever had. So now it's kind of common accepted knowledge that we've reached a point where we have, in a fit of absence of mind, handed absolute power to a man with absolute ambitions to destroy American democracy and to replace it with an autocracy that looks either like Putin's Russia or like Erdogan's Turkey or like Orban's Hungary. And so the challenge is, what do we do about it? Now, I don't have all the answers. I don't have most of the answers, but I do know one thing, and this is where I'm going to end, because ending on an optimistic note is usually better than just depressing an audience. The people in Squid got royally fed up with the dysfunction and the bitterness and the violence that was being spewed by their political leadership. And in Squid, a group of them got together and they crossed ideological lines. There were liberals, there were independents, but there were a goodly number of moderate Republicans. And they got together and they formed something called the Scrim Good Governance League. And they went back to the basics. They didn't have like high finance campaign. It wasn't all like, glitzy. They did the basics. They got volunteers and they knocked on one door after another, and they talked to people. And they explained what was at stake. And they explained how dangerous and dysfunctional a personality like William Armacost in charge of governance was. And they won. Over 2 electoral cycles, they drummed the QAnoners out, not just at the mayor's office, they drummed them out of every position on the city council. They drummed them out of every position in county government. They drummed them out of every board that they were trying to gain hold of, whether it was school boards or whether it was fire districts. Every board where these QAnoners tried to sort of put down roots, the Scrim Good Governance League went after them electorally and educationally, and they won. It was an extraordinary example of civic response to crisis. Now, obviously, that's one small town. Siskiyou County, Shasta County didn't have nearly as much success. Shasta County, they just went rightward, 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 and they're still going rightward. But the Scrim example shows that when a populace gets outraged enough and informed enough, they can break the hold of this right-wing movement. And I think that's the only way we get out of this mess. It's not through political spin doctors. It certainly isn't through high-paid consultants who aren't on the ground. It's through good old-fashioned engagement with electorates, not just in big cities, but in places like Scrim and Shasta and all these other areas that form the backbone of Trumpism. And I think eventually an aroused population is probably strong enough to take these guys down. But I also think that this republic is in the fight for its political life. We got into this fight because of 30 years of tolerating cascading inequality and irrationalism and violence. And that's where I'm going to stop. I hope I left enough time for questions, and I'm going to sit down.
It's funny you mentioned David Brooks, because he helped me get my first op-ed in the New York Times published. I'm not flexing, but 200 op-eds later, I think of what she said about clickbait. And I think of the titles and how they've evolved. They're very clickbaitable. And you probably know Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Is the op-ed is no longer my opinion. It is, how can my opinion be summed up in a headline? I'll get clickbaits. But earlier we were talking about my history of the Middle East, but actually I'm coming from San Diego State School of Public Health, where I teach a class on the evolution of pandemics. And there's the Masters in Humanitarian Action here now. And you said something, I'll just tell you where your book falls in the history of public health and pandemics. They say reporting is the first draft of history. You're the first person who's put it in writing, or you said it, I'm gonna have to buy your book now.
Double my sales.
The lockdown was about helping the hospitals not get overwhelmed. We always, any public health specialist will say this, we know this, and we're scared to admit it publicly because they think, well, we get lynched, that all this inconvenience wasn't about spreading the transmission. That would happen to me eventually. It was because our health infrastructure couldn't handle it. And when we say we, this is, I mean, I've taught pandemics in Spain, Italy, and this is public health specialists all around the world will say this. You're the first I've written it down in terms of kind of the historiography of pandemics and public health. And then you in your micro history, you bring, and you help me get another epiphany, and then I'll give you my question. It's this. I mean, generally when I teach in terms of humanitarian intervention, everywhere in the world where I taught COVID-19, the security sector enabled the health sector to function by providing protection, by taking care of the burials. Think in Bergamo, Italy, it was the army that was burying the dead. And you made me realize, even with this short anecdote with the sheriff, this was a major fault. The security sector was not helping the health sector. It wasn't working synergistically with the health sector. And it's only through that story, it was very powerful, I realized this is what was missing in the US compared to the rest of the world. My question is this, you mentioned Stalin, and I followed your work for the longest time on Orwell and the use of language, and as well as your work on incarceration. So, my specialty is Iraq, and I argue ISIS was born in an American detention facility known as Kambuka. You had the Abu Ghraib scandal, you have Guantanamo Bay, and so help me with my analogy, because with CCOT in El Salvador, when you mentioned Stalin, are we on the birth of, is this our Trump? Gulag, the Gulag archipelago. Is this the direction we're going now, where, Stalin outsourced all the problems to Siberia? Do you see this as a one-off, or do you see this as portending the future?
That's a great question. Oh my gosh. I don't think it's as systematic yet on Stalin, because Stalin's project, but first of all, Stalin's project came out of history. I mean, he wasn't the first person to send people to Siberia. The Tsars have been doing that for a long, long time. And so there was this sort of history of sending political dissidents and, and common criminals to this place far away that was, on the outer edges of the Russian Empire. I don't think Trump's project is quite a system. So I think there are ominous rumblings that he clearly wants to have security arrangements with more countries than just El Salvador. Ecuador would be another one where the newly elected right-wing president has been sort of openly calling for US and European military involvement. But there's clearly a space to use Latin America as a sort of backdoor place to put prisoners. Bukele is playing Trump in a way. Bukele is a uniquely opportunistic leader who got elected, by some measures, he's been very successful. He took a country that had the highest murder rate of any country on earth, and he used draconian measures to very, very quickly bring down the murder rate and gain control of an uncontrollable situation. So by his own measures, Bukele's been a success. He got re-elected in a landslide, so his public, or at least much of the public, supports what he's doing. And his outward face to the rest of the world is CCOT. I mean, if you ask most people in the world, what do you know about El Salvador? They're not going to know very much. I mean, they might know it used to be very violent, but most people in the world who've read the news in the last 3 months will have heard of CCOT. And depending on their politics, they'll think it's a great thing or a bad thing. CCOT's enormous. I mean, the scale, it's not a gulag, because a gulag implies many different places, but CCOT's more like a concentration camp. It's, I think, and I'm sure there are people here who, Patricia, if you studied CCOT's numbers, my reading of it is it currently housing 20,000 people. It's built to house a maximum of 40,000. And the numbers are, I mean, if you look at how they're incarcerated, they're incarcerated like in the Middle Passage. I mean, it's literally people so crammed together, there's no room for them to lie down. So, when he says 40,000 people, that's probably what a US prison can hold with 5,000 people, same space. But he's now talking about doubling its capacity. So if you double that to 80,000, Trump has called for him to build more prisons, I assume to at least hold over America the threat of mass deportations. But your question about whether it's quite as systematic as Stalin's. I tend to think it's more improvised, that Bukele came up with this offer, almost out of left field. And because Trump will latch onto any offer that offers a public spectacle of cruelty. I mean, that's who he is fundamentally. If he can produce a public spectacle of cruelty, he will leap at it. And so Bukele says to him, yeah, I'll house your Venezuelan gang members, just send them over to me, and I'll humiliate them in front of the cameras and everything else. And Trump loved it. And then, this idea, well, why don't we expand it to US citizens? That is the most bonkers idea of, I've ever heard in politics. There is no universe in which that's constitutional to do that. But he wants to hold over this threat, because if he can get away with even one citizen, he doesn't have to put thousands. If he can send even one US citizen to El Salvador at some point next few months and get away with it, he's broken the basic institutions of governance in this country. That's why the Kilmar Garcia case is so important. He's not a citizen, but there was an order to not report him to El Salvador. If the Trump administration can get away with keeping Garcia down in El Salvador, he shredded the notion of the rule of law. And I think he's well aware of that. So I think it started improvisationally, and I think he sort of now realized it's an extraordinary tool to increase his personal power, basically.
It reminds me a lot of the Panopticon, by the way, the CCon. If you look at Jeremy Benton's original drawings, it's a bit eerie, but thank you for that.
It's modeled on prisons in California, like
is that right? Okay.
which were designed at the height of the war on drugs. It just takes it to another level. It's about 10 times as large as Pelican Bay, but it's the same basic sort of operating principle.
Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for a very compelling, powerful, and eloquent presentation. It was wonderful. Scary, wonderful. I listened to a podcast Ezra Klein had with Stephen Kahn, who specializes on American illiberalism. So he cautions us not to sort of look for examples in Turkey and Hungary and other places, but look internally. And I come from Turkey, so I can give you lots of examples. What happens when a Trump-like figure stays in power for 20 years. So what I wanted, you referred to it when you talked about the last 30 years, the beginnings of Trumpism, and how we got to this point. I was just wondering if you can also reflect more on the historical context, because one of the arguments in that podcast is Trump might disappear, but Trumpism is here to stay. And more importantly, and using the Turkey example, it's been in power now, and power very quickly learns how to suppress opposition. So, going and knocking on doors and everything is going to be important, and walking the streets. And I can tell you every weekend I'm out there walking with thousands of people, which we have to do. But how do we deal with the fact that they've got the power now, which of course in previous periods in the US, they didn't have the power?
I think that is the ultimate question. And when you're talking about historical context, and I think historical context is so important, and I took it back 30 years, but you can take it back way further. You can look at the John Birch movement in the 1960s. You can look at George Wallace in the late 60s and early 70s. You can look at the John Birch movement in the 50s and 60s. You can look at McCarthyism in the 1950s, which has a direct lineage to Trump, because McCarthy's right-hand man was Roy Cohn. And when Trump was a young man, his father hired Roy Cohn to teach Trump how to talk. The demagogic techniques that Trump learned were straight from Roy Cohn, who got them from McCarthy. So there's a direct lineage from one demagogue to another. But you can go back further. You can go back to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. You can go back to the Know Nothing movement in the 1800s. There's been a strand of irrationalism in American politics right from the get-go. Irrationalism sort of combined with violence. What's different about this moment is it captured the executive. It's the first time it captured the executive. Even in McCarthyism, President wasn't a McCarthyite. I mean, Eisenhower didn't quite know what to deal with, how to deal with McCarthy, but instinctually Eisenhower was not a McCarthyite. Neither was Truman before him. This is the first time that the sort of strands of rationalism have managed to capture executive power. And you're right, power begets power. That once you have it, if you're willing to use it ruthlessly, you can do an awful lot of damage. Especially because, when I was growing up and I was studying politics and history in England, we were always told, well, the difference between England and America, England's got an unwritten constitution and America's got a written constitution. And the unwritten constitution was a set of norms, basically, that governed English society. Well, it turns out that a shockingly large part of American political life is also governed by unwritten norms, not by a written constitution. A lot of what Trump's doing is going to be interpreted by especially a conservative Supreme Court as constitutional. It's just nobody expected he would do it. But breaking down government agencies in the way he's doing, it's probably going to be, a lot of it will probably be upheld by the Supreme Court. Doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's expected. And it doesn't mean any other president would have done it. But there's enough wiggle room in the Constitution that you can say, all right, the president does have this power to do this. Invoking the Insurrection Act. Well, nobody in their right mind would say it's a good idea to invoke the Insurrection Act against a motley horde of, impoverished people fleeing somewhere else. But Trump's, angling for doing that on the border. The Alien Enemies Act, again, that was clearly intended as a law against invading armies, not against gang members. But there's going to be a lot of wiggle room there too as interpretation, because the executive, actually has a lot of authority to interpret the laws in certain ways. So if you have a leader who's willing to ignore the norms of decency, which turn out to be at least as important as the actual real constitutional written document, if once those norms of decency are broken down, he can bulldoze through a lot of institutions. But I would say one thing, you mentioned the Ezra Klein. I didn't hear that particular Ezra Klein podcast, but I heard other ones that he's done recently. And so, this idea that Trump goes, but you still have Trumpism. Yes and no. Yes, you have the conditions of Trumpism, but I'm not sure you have another figure who's capable of pulling a cult together in the way Trump has done. Because Trump's a cult. I mean, MAGA is a complete and utter cult. I don't for a minute think that JD Vance would have that power to, coalesce a similar cult. I don't even think Steve Bannon would, I'm trying to think of other, other Tucker Carlson might be another sort of candidate. But there's something unique about Trump's persona. And I don't fully get it because I see the man and I see, a blowhard. But a lot of people see Trump and they see the Messiah. I mean, quite literally, they see him in religious terms, which is a little bit how Jim Jones death cult in the 70s. But in a way, that's a cause for optimism because Trump's an old man. And, even if he weren't an old man, the laws of the universe are that everybody dies eventually. So, he's not immortal, and despite his own sort of, longing to be president forever and ever and ever, he won't be because tides of time will catch up with him. And yes, there will be other demagogues who follow, and yes, they will try and consolidate power like he did. I'm not sure they'll succeed in the same way.
But they can succeed in a worse way. Because we don't want to go to other countries just to see what, I can speak about Venezuela. We spoke the same way. Chavez, he's got to die someday, and he died sooner rather than later. And he was a much younger man than Trump, and we got Maduro, and we said the same thing. He's dumber, he doesn't have the charisma. We still have Maduro, and it's a different way of being bad, horrible, but still pretty darn bad.
No, and I think you're right, and I think that is a risk that you get a sort of even more militarized society after Trump if they can't sort of consolidate it around a cult. Again, sort of the optimist in me wants to think that we have a vibrant enough civil society still to push back against that, but I'm not sure we do, and I'm not sure 5 or 10 years from now that we will, which is why I think the struggles of today are so important, right? Because if the universities succeed in pushing back today, you have the potential for a generation of politically engaged students and professors 10 years from now. if the universities fold today, you have nothing. You know, I mean, universities are always the epicenter of resistance. If universities in 2025 back, yes, then 2028 or 2032 or whenever, things become a whole bunch bleaker. Which is why, you know, I know it's tempting to say, well, Harvard's got $50 billion and they don't need our support. I'll buy it for a minute. Everybody in this country has a stake in making sure Harvard wins this battle. And USD and everyone else who signed that document last week, you know, all of these universities need to win that battle.
I agree. I mean, my question would be, how far are we willing to go? How real is the courage? I mean, one thing is, and I think it's a great move and I completely support it. So it's a letter, but when universities start like, don't have $50 billion endowment, start feeling the impact of it, there is potential hardship. How far are we willing to go? So again, I want to be optimistic, but I just want to.
I think you're right. I don't know. And, you know, I mean, look, there's stories today, or stories started circulating last night, that Trump's going to use deprivation of federal aid, federal loans and Pell Grants. I mean, that would be devastating. That you know, there's no university in the country that could backstop. You know, if their students aren't getting federal loans or Pell Grants, who on earth is going to pay for those kids to go to college? So, yeah, I mean, if Trump really wants to burn it all down strategy, he probably can do it in the end.
Well, we maybe need to listen to David Brooks, you know, sort of creative forms of resistance. So, I mean, I didn't read that that article, but it sounds like a good.
It was a great article, except he never detailed what the creative forms of resistance were. You know, which is, I guess, what I'm doing. I don't really have the answers. Yeah.
I just have an observation. We all have to realize that he won the election with 77 million votes and even managed to get 1.5 million popular vote. And I believe that it's the inequality that's been created for decades. And let me give you, during my youth, I'm pushing 80. When I graduated from college many decades ago, everything in my home was made in America. All the appliances, the cars, it was all made here. Today, and we had a growing and thriving middle class. Today, that middle class is living paycheck to paycheck for less than $1,000 in the bank. 40% actually has been reported, and these articles are from the New York Times. They got less than $400 in the bank. These are the people that are voting for Trump. He tapped into a real issue. And it's this inequality. Yeah. It's a real issue. And they blame the government. The Donald Trump that they know is from The Apprentice. You're fired. Yep. They wanted somebody to go to our government and fire the people that's responsible for their decades of inequality. And it goes back decades. Take Jimmy Carter. He goes and deregulates aviation and trucking. Well, over 400,000 middle-class workers lost their jobs because of deregulation and trucking. If you're going to do something, you better know what's going to happen. Take NAFTA. Now, it wasn't started by Bill Clinton. It was actually started by Bush Sr. His only interest, he's an oil guy. He wanted to help American oil companies get control of petroleum and natural gas in Mexico. But it was Clinton who implemented it. 2.5 million Americans lost their jobs, went to Mexico. So both parties, you know, so the 77 million people voting for Trump, they didn't vote for him because he's a Republican. They're voting against both parties for putting them in the economic condition they are today. And that is, to me, the real driver. A third of all residential homes today, that's single-family homes, condos, and co-ops. They're investor properties. If you want to know what's wrong with our real estate market, everything's off what would normally be for sale, etc. And our government has allowed that to happen. You may not have ever heard of Neutron Jack and the General Electric Corporation. Well, he was a chemical engineer. He started working for General Electric Corporation and made his way up to the top. And one day he woke up and decided that GE wasn't making enough money. And he literally shut down hundreds of factories and laid off over 150,000 workers. What was our government to say? Sorry, you can't do that. And and the same thing for what happened with NAFTA. Where was our government to tell these companies, no, you're not going to shut down your factories here and move to Mexico, which is exactly what happened. So you've got people that have absolutely no faith in our government, and rightfully so. And until that changes.
I think you've done a really good summary there of where Trump comes from. Where I would sort of push back a bit is I don't think Trump was providing solutions. I think he was providing pro solutions.
You're absolutely right. He's enriching himself, his family.
But I think, it's the greatest con job in history because what he's done is he said, I'm on behalf of the little man and everything he's doing is about self-enrichment. But yes, that's where it came from and that's where the depressive government came from.
And the 77 million Americans are right. Our government has failed. And until that changes, we're gonna get more of this, in my opinion, this extremism.
I think one of my worries is, I really love the sort of, the way you set up your book. It's like sort of like classic political science, right? Like what works, what doesn't work. I worry that it doesn't necessarily scale to the national level, because at the national level, what we are witnessing is a transformation from a liberal free market economy to an economy based on crony capitalism. And crony capitalism is defined by like a number of different symptoms. One is like a systematic blurring of public and private interest, as we sort of see. It's defined by the undermining of the institution, the regulatory frameworks that promote security of individuals, that promote private property rights, that promote contract law. It's defined by the suppression of knowledge generation and sorts of places that we're in right now. It's defined by eventually by forced labor, whereby people can't choose to give up their free time to make money to spend as they will in their leisure time. So with all of that, if that transformation is complete, I just think that crony capitalism, just as free market capitalism synergizes very well with liberal democracy, crony capitalism synergizes very well with various forms of autocracy and with fascism in particular. And so I worry that once that yes, you can have civil society movements, but if the economic engine has been so distorted.
Yeah. And again, the optimism is sort of an awkward tag on it. I don't disagree with that, and I do think there's a risk of that happening. I think we're still at a moment where we're on a tipping point. It can go either way. Yeah. I think, if there isn't effective pushback over the next 4 years, I think this country's done. I mean, I really do. But I do think there's room at the moment and space still to protest, whether it's on the streets or whether it's through legal action or whether it's through media investigations and exposés. There's still just enough open space to push back. But I think the slide towards a new form of capitalism is extraordinarily rapid. And, in some ways, I talked earlier about the comparison with, the mass incarceration systems of the Soviet Union, for example, or the demagogic similarities of Trump to Hitler or Stalin or whatever it might be. But it's possible that the most important comparison is actually what happened in Russia as the Soviet Union collapsed between 1989 and 1991, or 1989 and 1993-4. That period of anything goes, crony capitalism, violence, etc., as a great, a great bureaucratic system imploded in on itself. And so, you had the tail end of the Gorbachev era, you had the Boris Yeltsin presidency, which was essentially just halfway, anything goes system. And then eventually you had the autocracy of Putin. And that occurs over a sort of 6-7 year period. We may be witnessing the same thing here. The spectacularly sudden collapse of a sophisticated bureaucratic system. Nobody thought the Soviet Union would collapse like that, and then it just went like a house of cards. We may be witnessing the implosion of the US state as an effective bureaucratic system of governance. And if that's the case, then my optimism, is entirely misplaced, because your trajectory then becomes the reality. And that's an open question to me, but I can certainly see the similarities between America in 2025 and the Soviet Union in 1991, probably, in the very, very dying days of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, Doge was supposed to, they probably see themselves as reformers. Like they tried to do, but it's fascinating when you mentioned the political science literature, because I remember back in 2002, it was Chavez's rise that introduced populism, reintroduced populism as a political science term. That's when it started to enter the literature. And when you mentioned crony capitalism, it's fascinating in terms of the language we're now using to describe US politics that we never did. Populism for one, crony capitalism. And I want to suggest another one that involves Erdogan and Saddam Hussein, and it's sultanism. I would never think I would use sultanism and apply it to the US, but things we only used to describe with, let's say, the regime of Saddam. We differentiated, there was national security and there was regime security. But now, I really could apply those concepts to the US. There's American national security, and then there's Trump's regime security. And I find this
not just Trump's, Musk's.
Yes.
Musk has the second most powerful security system on earth after Trump, and it's a private security system.
Yeah. Orwell got the Cold War right in terms of 1984 and these big blocks of alliances. But I think the naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming got this. And if you think of the nefarious, there were super empowered individuals in the 007 franchise. And I think Musk is, really something even Ian Fleming couldn't have imagined.
No, he's a caricature of the supervillain, isn't he?
I'm interested in your good governance committee example and the difference between local and national politics. So where I see hope at the moment is at the local level, when you can really talk to people about, this is why it matters for your school, for your community. So I'm wondering, in your positive example, if they did that, if they kind of separated the local politics from the national politics, or if they talked about them as one and the same or connected.
Both. So they very much separated and said, look, there are certain things that locally government is supposed to do. It's supposed to get the roads, potholes filled, it's supposed to make sure kids have after school work. So they talked about local issues, but they then also tied it in to what was happening nationally. So I don't think you have to sort of say it's either or. I think you can do both. But when you're sort of saying that the local level is where good things happen, that was true in Trump 1 as well. In many ways, the most radical moment in local US political history in the last century was 2016 to 2020. When you saw one progressive mayor after another elected, one progressive prosecutor put into the DA's office after another. You saw a racial reckoning and reimagining at a local level. You saw schooling being reformed. At a local level, Trump's era in 2016 to 20 was a golden age for liberal local politics in cities. You may see the same thing again now. And, I think there's a limited amount of power to go around. And, in some ways, the federal government is centralizing power now in a way that, we've never seen before. But in other ways, the federal government is becoming spectacularly absent. If you want environmental measures to be taken, federal government's doing nothing at the moment. You've got to go to California. You want data on marginalized communities. Federal government scrub them from the websites. And, the most Orwellian thing I've ever seen. They're literally scrubbing the websites and millions of pages of data. Local government's not scrubbing. Local government is collecting that data with a vengeance. If the Census Bureau stops collecting accurate data, which is entirely possible, bet your life that California, New York, and Illinois are going to step in and say, we need this data. We're going to have state consortium doing it. So I think in some ways the federal government becomes less and less powerful as Trump's autocracy takes off, and that gives space for. It may take 10 years to reimagine, but 10 years from now, it's entirely possible, even, without going into sort of apocalyptic visions of the US disintegrating, which could happen. But even without that, it's entirely possible that California, New York, Illinois, and a couple other big states will be sending trade delegates of their own to other parts of the world. It's entirely possible that they will be engaging in climate change diplomacy with other parts of the world, bypassing the federal government. You could imagine a situation where if things get really, really bad, California or New York puts its federal tax dollars into an escrow account and starts funding things that used to be done by the federal government out of state resources, education being a sort of prime case in point. If, those federal grants that are disappearing for science, it's the maddest thing in the world. It's walking America off the global science stage. Well, California is not going to stand by it. And, it may take a few years, but at some point, a California legislator or governor is going to say, you know what, we're going to set aside $20 billion to fund science research in California and other states, and the universities will be looking to the state instead of the federal government. So I do think that there's a reimagining that will happen that could empower blue states in particular. Red states are fucked. I mean, sorry for the language, but if you're living in a red state, which they may not know it, but they're completely reliant on federal tax dollars for food stamps, for Medicaid, for everything, because their own state governments do, jack shit. So if you are in a red state at the moment, you're going to lose everything. But if you're in a blue state, you might end up with actually better social protections and better universities than anything else. But it will take a few years for that to shake out.
So I'm from South Carolina originally, so I totally agree with you. People don't care about university funding, but they care about Clemson University, which is the state land grant university. So I'm thinking a lot about how you talk about it in local terms. You want to say Clemson, even if you don't believe all the elites are important for us as a society. I think there's something there even in red states.
Yeah. So then the question will be, how does your state, how does South Carolina respond when it starts losing basic investments, even in its beloved university? And I don't know how that plays out, but maybe it will empower red states too eventually.
I think it'll take a while. That's another conversation, but yeah.
Well, we are at time, but we have the room for a little bit, but I just want to be mindful if anyone has to get out of it.
So during the last few years, overall, the global shift is towards the center of the right politics. I'm wondering if you have touched upon that in your book, and what's your opinion that whether the global shift towards right is driving Trumpism, or is the other way around the globe?
It's a good question. I don't talk about it too much in the book. I mean, I do look at what was happening in COVID, internationally, but I don't talk too much in the book about that. I mean, I have thoughts on it. I think it's it's a circle of cause and effect. Trump accelerates the right wing in places like Germany and France and other places where the right is sort of knocking at the doors of power, and then they in turn accelerate Trumpism. You've got, I mean, look, my grandparents, one set of my grandparents were very involved in the Communist Party in mid-century Europe, in the British Communist Party. And my granddad was a historian of the First International, which was this sort of great international alliance of left-wing socialist groups in the 19th and early 20th century. I think what we're seeing now is a right-wing international. We're seeing all these right-wing groups coalescing, and their propaganda is circulating on the internet, which breaks down geographic boundaries. If you look at the links between Trump and Bolsonaro during Trump's first tenure, you look at the links today between Trump and Netanyahu, or Trump and Orban.
Meloni.
Yeah, exactly. Strangely, Meloni is proving to be surprisingly moderate in the current context. But or Trump and Putin. I mean, both of them fundamentally are about self-enrichment. But if they do have an ideology, it's an ideology of sort of Christian nationalism, basically, and male chauvinism. And it's about reasserting male power. It's about reasserting traditional, however hypocritical, but traditional religious structures. It's about putting gays back in the closet. It's about traditional family, etc., etc. Trump and Putin have a huge overlap. Look at Steve Bannon, who's sort of the intellectual ideologue behind Trumpism. He's always going on, about Viktor Orban, stuff like, and also some of Putin's sort of intellectual gurus. So I think very much that they're not working in isolation from each other; they're feeding off each other.
Just on the point, in the last 30 years or so, there's also been an infrastructure of right-wing ideology that has been established in this country and elsewhere. I mean, you identified three of the most important factors that pandemic and inequality and social media, but this infrastructure of right-wing doctrinaire dogma is really has been very powerful in halting Trumpism establishes from the Heritage Foundation to Claremont Institute, every other organization that we talk about, to put it on the paper.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right,
Investing in
there is
it.
a huge right-wing infrastructure, and it was built up over decades, half a century, basically. You can go back to sort of legal rulings in the early 70s that formed a sort of base of it. In that sense, it's quite similar to Nazism, which, you know, again, came out of a long intellectual project. It goes back to sort of proto-fascist rhetoric in the 1880s, like way before World War I and the collapse of World War I. There were nationalist movements that, you know, with hindsight, we can look at them and say, oh, that's a precursor to Nazism, isn't it? And so I think it's the same thing with Trump. He doesn't come out of nowhere. He comes out of, you know, hopefully he's the end point, but if he's not the end point, he's, you know, he's certainly the central focus of a movement that has been, you know, there's been growing and percolating since, you know, at least the 1960s or 70s, maybe even earlier.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I think this conversation we could have. The room is available, so people can linger for a little.
I will, I may grab a bit of food now. Yeah.